and for some, they have simply retained their seats at the conclusion of the governorship and state houses of assembly elections in 29 states across the federation. However, the election expectedly did not come without drama and issues. My guest looks at the just concluded governorship and state houses of assembly elections. Hello there, thank you for joining us on the program this week. I'm Gloria Umezuke. The governorship election has finally concluded. The All Progressives Congress won the governorship seats in about 19 states, while the People's Democratic Party won 7 states. The exercise did not go without drama. Well, we'll be looking at the elections with the Director, Center for Democracy and Development. But up ahead.
PDP, APC.
The Independent National Electoral Commission has released a preliminary election report saying the general assessment of the governorship election across the nation showed that the process went very well. Take a listen. On April 11, Nigerians across the country, except for the Federal Capital Territory, voted for members of the state houses of assembly and governors in 29 states. The Independent National Electoral Commission believes the process showed some improvement compared to the presidential elections. In its preliminary report, the electoral body said that 88.9% of polling units opened for accreditation as scheduled, while voting commenced on time at 73% of the polling units. The Commission also observed that the process of accreditation with the smart card readers went successful in a majority of the polling units. Though there were violent incidents in some states, most parts of the country, according to INEC, remained relatively peaceful during the elections. The Commission listed Rivers, Akwa Ibom, Cross River, Ebonyi and Ondo as states that witnessed some form of violence during the election. INEC's records showed that there were 66 reports of violent incidents targeted at polling units, the Commission's officials, voters and election materials. The states affected include Rivers State with 16 incidents, Ondo with 8 incidents, Cross River and Ebonyi with 6 incidents each, Akwa Ibom with 5, Bayelsa 4, Lagos and Kaduna with 3, Jigawa, Enugu, Ekiti and Osun with 2 incidents each, Katsina, Plateau, Kogi, Abia, Imo, Kano and Ogun with 1. The Commission encouraged aggrieved persons or groups to seek redress at the election tribunals. Well, joining me now is Dr. Jibrin Ibrahim, who analyzes the governorship elections in this interview. Well, Dr. Ibrahim Jibrin, you're welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Well, let's begin with your assessment of the just concluded presidential and governorship elections for 2015.
I think those elections are a landmark in Nigeria's electoral and democratic history. For a long time, we've been unable to organize free and fair elections, and these elections were largely free, fair, and above all, credible. I think that's an important development in our history. I think a number of measures were taken by various stakeholders to ensure the outcome of the elections were legitimate. First and foremost, the Electoral Commission was able to devise strategies, especially the use of technology, that made us insist, that created a situation rather, in which only real human beings were counted as voters. Secondly, I think the Nigerian people showed a real commitment to go through a credible electoral process. The election started late. In some places it dragged for 24 hours. Voters were patient. They decided to wait through and contribute their own quota towards ensuring that the elections were free and fair. Thirdly, in the period leading up to the elections, there was a lot of partisanship shown by security agencies, and the fear was that the security agencies will be blatant in their partisanship during the elections. However, I think for most states of the country, the security agencies behaved correctly and professionally. And I think finally civil society played a huge role in effectively observing, monitoring, intervening to make sure procedures were followed correctly and that what was happening in the elections was known to the world.
Now, even the issues we had with the elections in states like Imo, Rivers, Abia, and Akwa Ibom states, really, was there any need for all the violence and controversy?
No, there's no need ever for violence in elections. Elections are supposed to be peaceful events in which people make choices by the person they choose on a ballot paper. The difficulties we had in the states you mentioned are basically retrograde action in states where some of the incumbents and some of the politicians were determined to continue the old style of elections, putting guns in the streets, using thugs, bribing security agencies and INEC officials, and doing everything they could to falsify the outcome of the elections. I think the only thing we can say is that that occurred only in a few states, but in most of the countries, the elections were relatively free and fair.
Some people have described the election as Nigeria's finest moment, especially since June 12, when we supposedly had the last free and fair election. Is this also your perspective?
Well, I think it's a great moment for Nigeria as a country. It's a great moment for many reasons. The first issue is that you cannot really consolidate democracy until you are able to have alternation of power. That is, a situation in which a ruling party loses power because citizens have decided to vote it out. This election is important because it's the first time in our history as a nation in which we have had alternation of power, at least at the federal level. The second important issue about this election is that we've never had a situation in which opposition parties have been able to coalesce into a single party so that they pose a strong opposition to a ruling party. The attempts in 1964, in 1983, in 2003, and 2007, 2011 of opposition parties to merge all failed. This time, the opposition parties, three and a half of them, were able to merge into a strong and viable party, creating the basis for what we had, which is the alternation of power. The third important issue about this election is that this is the first time we are having a voters register and an identification of voters that's very credible. In previous elections, we had all sorts of problems about the voters list, and these problems were addressed, and the use of the permanent voter card and card readers are a major innovation that improved the integrity of the elections. These are the bases on which I think it's indeed an election that should be celebrated, not just by Nigerians, but by the whole world.
Do you think this exercise that we had really sent a clear message to the nation's political elites that, of course, things cannot go as usual, given that the will of the people prevailed this time around?
Absolutely. The message is very clear, and it is very loud. One of the important language Nigerian journalists use during elections is about governors delivering their states. There's an assumption that once you are a governor, you can use your incumbency to determine the outcome of an election in your favor. You remember the famous interview by Donald Duke, where he explained as far as you are a governor, you can determine electoral outcomes. The huge message from these elections is that so many governors that thought they could deliver specific outcomes failed, and people were able to make choices based on their conclusions about whether good governance or bad governance was the reality of those states. I think one important example of this was in Gombe State, where for the presidential elections, the people voted massively for the APC, but for the gubernatorial elections, they voted for the PDP. That means there's a certain level of maturity that has arrived at the level of the Nigerian voter. They are very discerning, they are able to distinguish issues, and they are able to act in a rational rather than emotional manner. I think what this is telling the political class is that the age of your winning an election just because you are part of a ruling party is gone, and that every election is a real contest, and in that contest, it is the voters that decide. It's a good moment for our democracy.
You know, even if people congratulate the fact that this is happening, you know, that one begins to wonder, are we going to see the much expected change we've been yearning for?
I think the change has occurred, which is to say that people wanted an alternation in terms of those conducting the affairs of state, and that alternation has occurred, and you are going to have a new federal government installed on 29th May, and the same in certain states where alternation occurred. So that's the change the voter expressed. Of course, there's a more profound issue about change in terms of some of the major issues identified in the change agenda. The APC defined 3 key issues in terms of their change agenda. The first is to fight the insurgency and significantly improve the security situation in the country. The second is to fight against the culture of public corruption and ensure that public resources are used for the public good. The third element in the change agenda is to provide jobs, especially for the Nigerian youth. Now, it's only after they come into office we are going to see the extent to which they are able to address this agenda they have defined for themselves. What we do know is that it's not going to be easy for them. The issue of security is difficult because the assets of our security agencies have been degraded over time. Training has not been sufficient, and therefore you cannot address the issue of security in a question of days or months, which many Nigerians are expecting. In terms of the provision of jobs, the government will be coming into power at a time in which there's a drastic fall in public revenue, and therefore the resources to reflate and dynamize the economy may not be fully available. The hope is that when you take up the third element of the change agenda, which is the question of fighting corruption, monies freed from previous corrupt practices could be pumped into the economy. But fighting corruption is itself going to be extremely difficult, because we have a public service culture that is steeped very deep into corrupt practices, but is also very competent in hiding and masking its corrupt practices. It's therefore going to be a very tough situation that the incoming government will find. But what we do hope as Nigerians is that in spite of the challenges, in spite of the difficulties, they'll be able to begin to turn around this country, which is in need of development, which is in need of hope, and which is in need of livelihoods for the inhabitants of the country.
But hold on with that thought. We're still with the former director of the Center for Democracy and Development, Dr. Ibrahim Jibrin. We're back on more to do with the elections and, of course, how to move forward. Join us again.